3 women hung from a wooden beam inside a frozen shed, bruised, bound, and fading beneath a roaring winter storm. No one knew where they were. No one knew they were still alive. But what if a loyal dog and a brave hero changed everything? Stick around to hear this incredible tale of survival and heroism that will leave you inspired. The blizzard didn't swallow everything. A battle-ready German shepherd caught the faint tremor of suffering buried in the wind and snapped to attention. His handler knew that look. Moments later, the dog was charging into the wideout, and the man following him was a retired Navy SEAL. Before we begin, share where you're watching from. And if this story stirs something in you, subscribe for more stories of honor, sacrifice, and bonds that never break. Your support truly means the world. Can you imagine facing death in the snow, only to be saved by an unbreakable bond between man and dog? Keep watching to find out how this rescue unfolds against all odds. The winter forest lay silent beneath a drifting curtain of white. The world hushed, as if holding its breath. Ethan Hale moved through the pines like a shadow born from the trees themselves. At 39, he carried the build of a man shaped by war, broad shoulders, disciplined posture, and movements trained to stillness. His face bore the carved edges of someone who had stared down too many storms, inside and out. Short dark hair brushed by frost, jawline unshaven by choice, eyes a muted steel gray that rarely revealed the tenderness buried beneath. He had been a Navy SEAL once, one of the best. But the years after retirement had driven him deep into the wilderness of Cold Water Ridge, searching for something close to peace. He never found it. What he carried instead was a weight he never spoke aloud, the memory of a stranger who once dragged him from a frozen river 15 years ago, saving his life, then disappearing before Ethan could even offer his name. A debt without a recipient, a promise without a place to land. At least he wasn't entirely alone. Shadow padded beside him, the black and tan German shepherd he had adopted from Valor Haven Working Dog Rescue, a sanctuary known for rehabilitating abandoned service dogs. Shadow was 3 years old, large for his breed, muscles coiled under a thick winter coat. His amber eyes carried both intelligence and caution, the look of an animal who had known hardship but refused to break. Ethan saw much of himself in the dog. Today's training was meant to be simple, a search and locate drill among the trees. Ethan tossed the scented cloth into the snow and signaled. "Fine," he murmured. Shadow lowered his head, nose to the wind, tail cutting arcs through the frosted air. Ethan followed, his breath rising in clouds. Then everything changed. Shadow stopped. His body stiffened, ears pricked so sharply it was as if the storm itself had frozen around him. Ethan felt the shift immediately. This wasn't the stance of a dog on command. This was instinct. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered. Shadow let out a low whine. Then he turned sharply to the west and bolted. Ethan's heart lurched. Shadow never broke training unless something was terribly wrong. He sprinted after him, boots slamming through knee-deep snow, wind clawing at his face. The scent hit him then, the metallic sting of blood woven faintly into the storm. He tasted it on the air before he saw anything at all. Shadow led him to an old structure half buried under snow, a frost-hollow logging shed, a long-abandoned timber outpost. Its roof sagged under the weight of years and storms. Ethan had passed it many times and never spared it a second thought. Tonight, it felt like the center of the world. Shadow growled, hackles rising. Ethan approached the warped wooden door and pressed his gloved palm to it. Cold. Unnaturally cold. A draft leaked from inside, carrying something that made his gut tighten. He pushed the door open. The sight inside clawed a gasp from his throat. 3 women hung from a thick support beam, wrists bound behind their backs with industrial zip ties, bodies suspended by ropes looped crudely under their arms. Snow blew through a shattered window, dusting their hair, their faces, their bruised limbs. One woman's boots barely brushed the floor. Another hung limp, unconscious. For a heartbeat, Ethan froze, not in fear, but in fury so sharp it felt like iron in his lungs. He moved. "Shadow, watch!" He didn't need to check whether the dog understood. Shadow had already planted himself in the doorway, a guardian carved from instinct. Ethan sprinted forward, catching the nearest woman by the waist to ease her down. She was tall, early 40s, with chestnut-brown hair matted to her cheeks and a leadership carved by hardship. Marissa Lane, though he didn't know her name yet. Her face was swollen on one side, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. The second woman trembled when he touched her, petite, mid-30s, with soft freckles across pale skin and sandy blonde hair tangled from the struggle. This would be Danny Brooks, but now she was only a fragile body fighting the cold. Ethan cut the zip ties and wrapped her gently in his coat. The third woman nearly slipped through his grip. She was dangerously cold, her skin almost translucent. Long dark hair spilled over her shoulders, lashes dusted with frost, lips fading blue. She looked younger, late 20s, graceful even in collapse. Emily Dawson. The name would soon matter more than Ethan could imagine, but at this moment, she was simply dying. Ethan checked her pulse. Weak, a flutter barely there. Her body was shutting down. "Stay with me," he murmured, though he didn't know if she could hear. Shadow whined softly and moved closer, pressing his warm body against Emily's side. "Good boy. Keep her warm." The storm outside screamed through the trees, a sound like nature mourning. Ethan worked fast, checking vitals, elevating their heads, wrapping each woman in layers of fabric stripped from his own gear. His breath grew harsh. He hadn't rescued civilians like this since the war zones of his past. "Who did this to you?" he whispered, though none were awake to answer. He scanned the shed. Bootprints, tire tracks, signs of dragging. Whoever left these women here hadn't meant to come back. They had intended the storm to finish the job. "Not on my watch." The words rose inside him like a vow. He dragged a snow timber sled, the old wooden hauler he used for firewood, to the shed entrance. One by one, he secured the women onto blankets layered over the sled. Their bodies shook, breaths uneven, but they still breathed. Shadow trotted at his side, alert and tense, ears rotating toward every sound in the storm. Ethan gripped the sled rope, looped it across his chest, and braced himself against the wind. "Hold on," he whispered, voice raw with a protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. "Just hold on." He pulled. Through blinding snow, through wind that cut like knives, through a forest that felt suddenly haunted by more than cold. Each step was punishment, but he refused to slow. The women's lives were slipping with every moment. His cabin finally appeared, a dim glow through the storm. Shadow sprinted ahead, barking, urging Ethan forward. The moment Ethan pushed the door open, warm light spilled onto the snow. He carried each woman to the fireside, setting them down gently, almost reverently. The flames cast shadows across their battered faces. This night was far from over, but it was the night everything began. The cabin walls creaked softly as wind pressed against them, a slow and steady reminder that the world outside remained merciless. Inside, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm ember glow across the small living space. Ethan Hale moved quietly between the three women laid out on blankets, monitoring their breathing, checking for signs of shock, adjusting layers to keep their cores warm. He worked with the same steady precision he used in the field, measured, focused, and silent. Shadow rested near Emily Dawson's side, the big German shepherd curled protectively around her arm. Every few minutes, he lifted his head to study her face with amber eyes full of worry, then pressed his nose to her wrist as if checking that she was still with him. It was unusual behavior. Shadow rarely permitted strangers into his space. But something about Emily had broken through his guarded nature. Ethan knelt beside Marissa Lane, the eldest of the three women. Now that she was awake, her sharp features stood out clearly, high cheekbones, a strong jaw softened only by exhaustion, and chestnut hair cut in a practical shoulder-length style. She carried herself like someone used to being responsible for others, someone who made difficult decisions and lived with them. Even battered and bruised, her dark brown eyes watched everything with a clear, steady awareness. "You're safe," Ethan said quietly. "But you need to stay still. Your ribs might be bruised." Marissa winced as she tried to sit. We didn't think anyone would find us. Her voice was rough, strained by cold and fear. You weren't meant to be found, Ethan replied. His tone was calm, but a fire glowed behind his eyes. Danny Brooks stirred next. She was smaller, with sandy blonde hair and soft freckles that stood out starkly against her pale skin. Unlike Marissa, Danny had a gentleness to her, a softness in her expression that spoke of someone who spent her life comforting children rather than confronting violence. Her blue eyes blinked open, glassy and confused. Where are we? She whispered. My cabin, Ethan answered. You're safe now. She flinched at a sudden pop from the fire, her nerves raw. Ethan noticed, trauma responses, recent, severe. He placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. You're not alone anymore. Finally, Emily Dawson opened her eyes slowly, like someone surfacing from deep water. She was younger than the others, maybe late 20s, with long, dark hair that had partially dried by the fire. Her skin was warm in tone, but drained of color by the cold, her lips still tinged with blue. There was a quiet resilience in the way her eyes moved, soft hazel eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. She looked at Shadow first. The dog thumped his tail once, gently, as if reassuring her. Then she looked at Ethan. Did you carry us out of there? She asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan shook his head. Shadow found you. I just followed. Emily's gaze drifted toward the fire, and her fingers curled weakly into the blanket. Thank you, she whispered. Ethan nodded once. Gratitude made him uneasy. It always had, but he accepted the words with quiet sincerity. A heavy silence settled over the cabin until Marissa took a long breath, fighting through the pain. We need to tell him, she said, looking at the others. Danny nodded, wiping tears from her eyes. Emily's jaw tensed, as if bracing herself. Ethan sat back on his heels. Tell me what happened. The three women exchanged a glance, fear, exhaustion, and determination tangling in the moment between them. Marissa was the first to speak. We work for Spring Light Children Advocacy Center. She began slowly, her voice low and controlled. We protect vulnerable kids, runaways, at-risk teens, children from unstable homes. Danny folded her hands tightly. For months there were signs that something was wrong. Strange men hanging around the outreach events. Kids talking about being offered rides home. A few disappeared for hours before coming back acting different. Emily swallowed hard. We started digging quietly. And what we found? She paused, shuddering. There's a trafficking ring using community centers as recruitment grounds. They target the youngest, the loneliest, the ones who won't be missed right away. Ethan felt the muscles in his back tighten. He had seen horrors in war zones, but nothing compared to organized cruelty inflicted on children. Marissa continued. We found evidence, enough to expose them, enough to get them arrested. So, we hid the 5 children they were targeting. Hidden where? Ethan asked sharply. In a safe house outside town, Danny answered. But we didn't get far. Emily's eyes darkened. They knew. Somehow they knew everything. They came to the center with trucks, armed. They grabbed us before we could warn anyone. And you think they were planning to kill you? Ethan said, not as a question, but a conclusion. Marissa nodded. We weren't supposed to survive the night. Ethan leaned back, his pulse slow but heavy. He had always trusted his instincts. Those instincts now told him this wasn't a small operation. This was organized, funded, and deeply rooted. Did you see their faces? He asked. Yes, Marissa replied. But it won't matter. They hide behind others. They burn evidence. And they aren't afraid of killing women who stand in their way. Danny hugged her knees, trembling. We don't even know if the kids are safe. If they found us, maybe they found them too. Emily pressed a hand to her forehead, eyes filling with fear. We need help. Real help. Ethan stood, walked to the wooden shelf near the window, and retrieved a compact black device, AG-30 satellite emergency phone. Rugged, scratched, but reliable. "It's not much," he said, "but it connects where nothing else does. Bought it after I moved out here. Forest Service encourages it for people who live alone." He powered it on. The device hummed to life. Then he turned to the women. "I'm sending everything you told me and everything I saw at the shed." He began gathering evidence from the table: zip ties with stamped manufacturing codes, the cloth scrap torn from an attacker's sleeve, the empty vial from a sedative injection, a blueprint mold he had taken from the shed floor, and a photo of the tire tracks. As he photographed and documented each item, he felt the familiar clarity of mission take hold: sharp, cold, absolute. When he finished, he transmitted the data to 2 contacts: FBI Field Office, flagged urgent, Commander Marcus Teller, his former SEAL leader, a man with strong features, silvering hair, and a reputation for relentless pursuit of justice. Ethan lowered the device. "Help is coming," he said. Outside, the blizzard howled, but inside the cabin, something shifted. Hope, fragile, flickering, took its first breath. Shadow settled closer to Emily, resting his heavy head on her arm again. Ethan noticed, and for the first time since he dragged the 3 women out of that shed, he allowed himself a silent promise. They would not face the next storm alone. Night still pressed against the cabin walls when the satellite phone crackled to life. Ethan Hale stood at the small wooden table, arms folded across his broad chest, eyes narrowed as the delayed transmission from the FBI came through. The voice on the other end was clipped, distorted by weather interference. Yet, the message was unmistakably grim. "Your location is compromised. Satellite sweep shows movement near your sector. We estimate several unidentified vehicles positioned 2 miles south of Cold Water Ridge. Reinforcements are en route, but we need hours. Repeat, hours." Ethan exhaled slowly. His jaw tightened, a habit formed after years of swallowing fear instead of feeding it. "Copy that," he said, voice calm, even as something cold turned over in his chest. Shadow rose immediately, sensing tension the way only a well-trained canine could. The large German shepherd padded closer, tail low, amber eyes trained on Ethan's face. Behind them, the 3 women stirred on their blankets near the fire. Marissa Lane was the first to sit up, pressing a hand gingerly against her ribs. Her face remained drawn, bruises cutting sharp shadows beneath her cheekbones. "What's happening?" she asked. Ethan turned toward her, the firelight sharpening the angles of his face. "The cabin is no longer safe. They've already been watching the area. We stay here, we die here." Danny Brooks shivered, even though she sat closest to the flames. She wrapped her arms around herself, sandy blonde hair falling in disarray across her pale face. "We can't go out in this cold." "We can," Ethan corrected gently. "And we will. If we don't move now, they'll find all of us before morning." Emily Dawson pushed herself upright, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs. She looked weaker than the others, still recovering from the deepest level of cold, but her hazel eyes carried a quiet, steady fire. She nodded once. "Tell us what to do." Ethan grabbed his pack from the corner. "We follow the tracks they left behind. Whatever vehicles carried you out here, those trails will lead us straight to the next point in their route." Marissa frowned. "You think they used the same road again?" "I think they're confident no one survived their last run," Ethan replied, slipping into his insulated jacket. "Men like that underestimate the mountains, and they underestimate you." Shadow barked once, short and sharp, as if agreeing. They left the cabin under the cover of darkness. The storm had quieted, but cold still clung to the forest like a living thing. Ethan helped the women into extra layers, thermal jackets, gloves he kept for emergencies, and distributed 2 chemical warming packs for their pockets. He moved with a deliberate efficiency, each motion controlled, practiced, protective. By contrast, the women moved carefully, testing their strength with each step. Marissa walked with stubborn determination, straight back despite her injuries. Danny tread lightly, staying close to Emily as though seeking comfort. Emily walked silently beside Shadow, one hand brushing his fur as if drawing steadiness from him. The moon watched them from behind a veil of drifting clouds. Ethan crouched near the snowbank ahead, tracing his gloved fingers along a deep indentation. Heavy truck, he murmured. Off-road direction, all tracks point. He rose. Stay close. Step where I step. They trekked through the woods, weaving between pines bent low with snow. The only sounds were the crunch of frozen earth beneath their boots and the soft breath of Shadow trotting ahead, nose close to the ground. For the first hour, no one spoke. Then they reached the remains of a small campsite, still warm. A circle of scattered ash glowed faintly under the snow crust. Rope fibers clung to a fallen branch. A torn strip of denim flapped weakly in the wind. Danny's breath hitched. They were just here. Ethan scanned the tree-line, instincts sharpening. Which means they didn't go far. Nearby, he spotted something else. A length of coarse rope dangling from a pine, its fibers stiff with frozen moisture. They used this tree to anchor something, he said quietly. Or someone. Marissa clenched her jaw, fury simmering behind her eyes. Emily bent to pick up a small metal ring half buried in the snow. From a utility belt, she murmured, analyzing it with the trained eye of someone used to handling equipment at community events. Looks military grade. Ethan took it from her, examining the ridged surface. Good eye. These aren't street-level thugs. These men know tactics, or were taught by someone who does. Shadow suddenly turned his head north, ears forward. Ethan froze. He has something. He gestured for silence, and silence fell. Shadow trotted toward a narrow game trail winding deeper into the forest. At the entrance lay a nearly extinguished cigarette but still warm to the touch. The scent was faint but sharp. Ethan recognized it immediately, Castrol Red, a brand popular among ex-mercenaries. Move! He whispered. They followed the new trail through a series of switchback turns leading toward an old fire access road. There, the tracks grew clearer, ruts carved deep into the snow by heavy vehicles. Cold Canyon Mineral Extraction Plant. Ethan knew it before he said it. The tire impressions matched the access road leading toward the abandoned mica mine several miles north. The place had been shut down 8 years earlier after a collapse killed 2 workers. Now it sat as nothing more than a hollow skeleton of steel and concrete. Except skeletons made good hiding places. We head to Cold Canyon, Ethan said. Marissa inhaled sharply. That's where they took the children. Danny covered her mouth. Please tell me they're still alive. Emily placed a steady hand on Danny's back. We'll get them. We have to. The conviction in her voice softened Ethan's features. Even bruised and exhausted, she radiated resilience, something delicate yet unbreakable. Shadow brushed against her leg, sensing her fear, offering silent comfort. They pushed on. Hours later, snow had begun to fall again, slow flakes drifting through the dying night, when they reached a deserted ranger station near the foot of the ridge. Ethan decided they would rest briefly before tackling the climb toward the plant. Inside, the station was little more than a single-room shelter with cracked windows and a rusting stove. They gathered near the small desk. Emily lowered herself to sit, breathing out in visible relief from the strain on her injured muscles. To calm Danny's trembling, she reached into her coat and brought out a small weathered photograph. Here, she said softly. Look at something warm, something real. In the dim firelight, Danny smiled faintly at the image of a farmhouse, a man and a young girl standing proudly with a horse. It's your family. Emily nodded. My dad took this when I was 7. Ethan didn't mean to look. He only glanced. But the sight struck him like a blow. The man in the photograph, broad shoulders, lined face, deep-set eyes full of kindness, was unmistakable. Thomas Dawson, Ethan whispered, voice cracking for the first time in years. Emily blinked. You knew my father? Ethan stepped closer, holding the photo as if it were fragile. Memories he had buried rose like ghosts. The icy river, the crushing cold, the strong arms dragging him out before darkness closed in. He saved my life, Ethan said, voice low and reverent. 15 years ago, during a training accident, pulled me from a frozen river, Hid me in his barn for 2 days while the storm tried to kill us both. Emily covered her mouth with trembling fingers. I never forgot his face, Ethan continued, or the warmth he offered a stranger. I carried the promise of repaying him, but I never found him again. Her eyes glistened. He died 5 years ago. Ethan bowed his head. I'm sorry. She shook her head. No, he would have wanted you to live, and he'd want you to keep living, right? Ethan met her gaze, a spark of determination rising in his chest. Knowing you're his daughter, he said, voice firming, I have one more reason not to let anything happen to you. I'll protect you no matter how dangerous this gets. Shadow, lying beside Emily, pressed his head against her knee, a silent oath from both man and dog. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint rumble of distant engines. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. Snow swept across the ridgeline in furious spirals as dawn struggled to push through the storm. The abandoned Cold Canyon mineral extraction plant rose from the whiteout like the skeleton of some forgotten giant, rusted steel towers, shattered conveyor belts, and long corridors of dark mica-dusted concrete echoing with ghostly drafts. Ethan Hale studied the structure from behind a fallen pine, his breath forming pale clouds in the freezing air. His gray eyes swept the area like a trained predator. This place had once produced mica for electronics before a structural collapse shuttered it 8 years ago. Now the plant served a darker purpose, its maze of tunnels and storage rooms offering perfect cover for a trafficking ring. Shadow crouched beside him, a coiled spring of muscle and instinct, snow gathering lightly across his black and tan fur. The German shepherd's ears pricked sharply, following sounds Ethan couldn't yet detect. Behind Ethan, the 3 women gathered close against the wind. Marissa Lane steadied herself with one hand on a broken railing, her chestnut hair whipping across her face, eyes fierce despite lingering pain. Danny Brooks hugged her coat tighter, freckles standing out against her pale cheeks as she fought both fear and cold. Emily Dawson stayed nearest to Shadow, drawing calm from him. Her dark hair was tucked into her collar, cheeks flushed from the icy air, but her hazel eyes were resolute. This is it, Ethan said quietly. Kids are inside. We move fast and quiet. Marissa nodded. We stay together. No mistakes. Ethan motioned them into position. He and Shadow took the rear entrance, an old loading bay with rusted chains dangling like skeletal vines. The dog slipped through first, body low, paws silent on the frost-veiled concrete. Ethan followed, scanning corners and checking the shadows where old machinery once roared. Inside, the plant smelled of metal, dust, and something far more recent, cigarette smoke and boot grit. He signaled left. Shadow patted ahead, nose twitching. Danny and Marissa circled toward the old maintenance hallway, using their knowledge of lock systems from the community center to handle the rusted padlocks on the storage rooms. Their hands shook from cold, but their determination steadied them. Meanwhile, Emily remained at the exterior door, standing guard behind a sheet of rusted metal she had propped up as a makeshift shield. She watched the yard, her breath fogging around her, listening for any sign of danger. Shadow stopped suddenly. Ethan crouched, pressed against the wall. He inched toward the metal door ahead. Voices, 2 men bored, speaking crudely about the cargo. Ethan's jaw tightened. With a hand signal, Shadow moved into position behind a stack of crates and crouched. Ethan sprung the ambush with silent precision. One guard went down in a chokehold. The second spun around, eyes widening, but Shadow lunged, powerful jaws clamping on the man's forearm, dragging him down before he could shout. Ethan disarmed both in seconds, zip-tying their wrists. Good boy, he whispered, giving Shadow's neck a quick squeeze. He turned the corner, then froze. 5 children huddled behind a metal cage, shivering in layers of mismatched clothing. Their faces were streaked with dirt, fear sitting heavy in their wide eyes. A small boy whispered, Are you here to take us home? Ethan's voice softened. Yes, we're getting you out of here. Marissa and Danny arrived just in time, their expressions crumpling at the sight of the terrified children. The women worked quickly, using tools scavenged from the plant's workbench to pry open the locking mechanism. Emily moved from her guard post to check on the children one by one, her gentle hands thawing their panic with warmth only compassion could give. When the last child stepped free, Ethan looked toward the broken windows facing the valley. "We move now." The return to the cabin was faster than their journey out. Ethan pulled the children in the snow timber sled while Shadow and the women remained vigilant along the trail. Their breaths were visible in the frigid dawn, and every rustle of wind sounded like pursuit, but they made it back, cold, exhausted, shaken, yet alive. The children were tucked into blankets near the fire, given warm broth and water. The cabin felt momentarily safe, but safety never lasted long in a war like this. As night fell, Shadow suddenly rose from his resting place and growled low, deep, and dangerous. Ethan immediately grabbed his rifle and stepped toward the window. Tracks in the snow, dark shapes moving through the trees. "They found us," Ethan said, his voice almost too calm. Marissa paled. Danny backed toward the children. Emily stood so close to Ethan, her shoulder brushed his arm. "We can fight." Her voice was soft but steady. Ethan glanced at her, really looked, and something inside him anchored. "Yes," he said. "We can." Ethan began directing them with the sharp command of a man who had led teams under fire. "Marissa, string bells around the perimeter. Anything moves, we'll hear it." Marissa moved quickly, using emergency hiking rope to tie small cabin bells between trees, creating an alert system that jingled faintly in the wind. "Danny, flashlights and glass. We want glare. Scatter the reflections and blind anyone trying to take aim." Danny nodded and arranged mirrors and cracked lantern lenses to bounce harsh beams around the clearing. "Emily, help me with barricades." Together they stacked tables, chairs, and winter sandbags into defensive cover. Emily's breast shook from cold and fear, but her hands moved steadily. Once, a board slipped and nearly struck Ethan's shoulder, but she caught it in time. "You okay?" he asked. "Not really," she admitted. "But we're doing this anyway." Shadow helped Ethan set up a gas canister trap near the back entrance, non-lethal, but blinding if triggered. Ethan buried a wooden hutch under the floorboards to hide the children, layering blankets inside to keep them warm. Everything was ready just as the first shot tore through the night. Gunfire echoed like thunder across the valley. Wood splintered. Bells rang wildly. The cabin shuddered under blows aimed at the doors. Ethan fired back from the window, controlled and precise. Marissa shouted warnings from the back wall as shadows moved through the trees. Danny shielded the children and monitored barricades. Emily stayed beside Ethan, loading rounds into the spare magazine with trembling but quick hands. A violent crack split the air. A panel of wood exploded near Ethan, sending splinters flying. One piece struck his shoulder, spinning him backward. Emily screamed his name and lunged, dragging him away from the collapsing frame. Her fingers dug into his jacket, pulling him behind cover. "You're hit." "I'm fine," Ethan grunted, though blood seeped through his sleeve. "Stay low." Shadow roared, a sound between a bark and a battle cry, and charged toward the back door where an intruder tried to slip in. The dog slammed into the man, knocking him to the ground and clamping his jaws onto the attacker's wrist. Chaos raged in the storm of gunfire and wind. The criminals advanced, relentless and organized. They had military precision, hardened eyes, and weapons that glinted under the snow's reflection. Just when the cabin door began to splinter under a battering ram, everything exploded into blinding white light. Flood lamps shouted commands, boots pounding through snow. "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" SWAT formed a wall of armor and rifles. FBI agents poured into the clearing, and at their lead, cutting through the snow like a blade of certainty, was Commander Marcus Teller, tall, broad-shouldered, his silver hair soaked by the storm, jaw tight with fury at what he saw. Within minutes the gunmen were face down in the snow, restrained and disarmed. The storm quieted, as if the night itself exhaled. Emily wrapped her arms around Ethan from behind, trembling with relief. Shadow returned to Ethan's side, breath steaming in the cold. The nightmare was over, and from the criminal's confessions that night, 10 more children, hidden, terrified, waiting for transport, were rescued before dawn. Snow still clung to the rooftops of Pinebrook when the town gathered in the central square, a place lined with cedar beams and old lanterns that glowed softly through the early morning chill. The battle at the cabin was already whispered as legend, told over diner counters, gas station porches, and the crackling radios of snowplows clearing the mountain roads. Today, the town chose to honor those who had stood against the storm. Ethan Hale stood near the makeshift stage, shifting slightly under the weight of attention. He had always been a man carved from quiet places, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw shadowed by several days of stubble and a pair of gray eyes that held a lifetime of storms. Years of service had left faint creases around his eyes, not from age, but from watching too much loss. Now he wore a clean winter coat over his bandaged shoulder, the pain still lingering beneath, but pushed aside with the discipline of a soldier. Shadow sat dutifully at his side, tail curled neatly around his paws. The 3-year-old German shepherd looked almost regal with his thick black and tan coat brushed, and his rescue harness polished to a shine. His amber eyes stayed alert to every sound, children laughing, boots crunching, the rustle of flags in the cold breeze. Yet he remained calm, sensing that today was different. Marissa Lane, Danny Brooks, and Emily Dawson stood a few steps away. They had been given clean winter outfits for the ceremony, no longer wrapped in trauma or exhaustion. Marissa, tall and steady, with her chestnut hair tied in a low knot, held herself with the grace of a leader who had walked through a nightmare and still kept her chin up. Danny appeared softer today, her freckles bright against newly warmed skin, her auburn hair tucked behind her ears, her eyes no longer filled with shaking terror, but with a quiet resilience. And Emily stood with her dark hair loose around her shoulders, cheeks touched pink by the cold, her hazel eyes warmer than the sun rising behind the ridge. She stayed unconsciously close to Ethan, as if her heart had already chosen where home was. The mayor, Samuel Rohr, stepped onto the wooden platform. He was a stout man with a friendly face weathered by mountain life, wearing a thick wool coat and a red scarf his wife had knitted. His voice carried easily across the courtyard. "Today," he said, "Pinebrook honors heroes." Applause rippled through the crowd. "Ethan Hale," the mayor continued, "former Navy SEAL who risked his life twice to protect innocent children and defend our community." Ethan straightened, though humility softened the edges of his stance. The mayor pinned a silver medal onto Ethan's coat, the Pinebrook Valor Cross, its weight cold against the fabric. The crowd cheered, and Ethan dipped his head slightly, uncomfortable but grateful. "And to Shadow," Rohr added, turning toward the dog with a grin, "whose bravery saved lives before backup could even reach the mountains." A handler from the Pinebrook Sheriff's Department stepped forward with a small decorated box and opened it to reveal a dark blue ribbon with a bronze paw emblem. "The Valor K9 Medal of Service," he announced. Shadow sat tall as the medal was clipped onto his harness. A collective awe swept the square. Several children waved, and Shadow tilted his head, tail thumping lightly. Next, the mayor faced the 3 women. Marissa Lane, Danny Brooks, and Emily Dawson, 3 who defended vulnerable children long before help arrived. "You are the type of courage this world rarely sees." They each received plaques engraved with their names and the words, "For treasuring every child's life above your own." Marissa's eyes glistened. Danny pressed a hand over her heart. Emily looked briefly toward Ethan, and in that glance, something unspoken passed between them. The ceremony closed with applause, warm handshakes, and grateful townsfolk offering baked goods and scarves as thanks. Later that afternoon, news spread that Spring Light Children Advocacy Center had received large emergency grants from 3 national organizations. Within a month, the center would expand to triple its size, with a sensory-safe therapy wing, a children's garden warmed by heat lamps, new counseling rooms, and a fully equipped canine-assisted therapy and safety unit named Shadow's Haven. Marissa cried openly when the announcement came. Danny hugged her tightly. Emily stood still, hand over her mouth, overwhelmed. Ethan rested a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. You helped build this, he murmured. No, Emily whispered. We all did. A week later, the snow lifted enough for Ethan to make the drive to Dawson Ridge, the place where Emily's father had once worked the land. The ridge sat quiet and wide beneath a golden sunrise that spilled warmth over the frozen valley. The remains of the old Dawson farmhouse stood nearby, aged wood beams, a leaning corral, and the faint scent of memories carried by the wind. Emily stood beside Ethan, hugging her coat close. The ridge painted a soft glow across her face, making her eyes shimmer like sunlight on thawing ice. My father loved this place, she said quietly. He always said the sun hit different here. Ethan studied her, the courage she carried, the gentle strength, the echoes of her father's kindness living in her voice. He stepped closer, the snow crunching under his boots. Emily, he began, his voice low and earnest. Your father saved my life. But you saved the part of me I thought was gone forever. Emily's breath hitched. He slowly knelt in the snow, not with ceremony, but with sincerity. His broad shoulders bowed slightly, eyes lifted to hers. Your father gave me a chance to live. You gave me a reason to keep living. If you'll have me, I want to protect you for the rest of my life. Emily's eyes filled with tears, warm, shimmering, full of gratitude. She nodded through a trembling smile. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Ethan. Shadow barked once, sharp, joyful, as if sealing the promise. Ethan rose and wrapped Emily gently into his arms. Snow fell lightly around them, soft as a blessing. The story ended not with triumph over darkness, but with the quiet rebuilding of hope, 3 women reclaiming their futures, 15 children finding safety, 1 shelter expanding into a beacon, and 2 hearts deciding that peace wasn't something found, but something built together. Over Dawson Ridge, dawn broke fully, warm, golden, promising new tomorrows to every soul who had survived the storm. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or blinding light. Sometimes they come quietly, carried in the footsteps of a loyal dog, in the courage of a broken woman who refuses to give up, in the heart of a man who chooses sacrifice instead of fear. And maybe, just maybe, those moments are the fingerprints of God Himself, moments where He whispers that no darkness is too deep, no winter too cold, and no soul too lost for His grace to reach. Tonight's story reminds us that even in the harshest storms of life, God still sends someone, a soldier, a friend, a stranger, a K9 with a heart tuned to heaven. Or maybe He sends you to be the light for someone else. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who might need a reminder that hope is never gone. Leave a comment below. I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy stories of courage, faith, and the quiet miracles God plants in our everyday lives, please subscribe so we can meet here again and walk through more moments of grace together. May God bless you, protect your home, steady your heart, and shine His gentle light on every step you take.